about it, if there is a God who made the universe and everyone in it, it's not at all irrational to think that he could do a miracle like raising somebody from the dead.
Right.
Like it's actually kind of irrational to think that couldn't be possible.
Right.
So if there's no God, of course somebody couldn't be raised from the dead. But if we're open to the possibility, maybe there is a God, then we should also be open to the possibility that God sent his only son, not only to die for us, but also to be raised so that we could live with him forever.
Rebecca, welcome back to the happy hour.
Thank you for having me virtually, long distance.
Well,
our long distance relationship continues.
It is a continuing relationship, and you were just on the show in December, and I am never tired of you, and I don't think the listeners are tired of you either. And so as long as you don't get tired of me, we'll continue to ask you back, Rebecca, all the time, because it's really an honor to chat with you.
That's really kind.
Well, I want to start before we jump in. Today's Good Friday, and so we're going to talk about what that means for us as followers of Jesus, and even what Sunday means for us, even more as followers of Jesus. But I want to start out by just telling you this is yesterday, we're recording this on a Monday, and yesterday at church, Rebecca, was we started our very first class, and we're going through Secular Creed.
Oh, yay.
And I'm a table leader. And so I got my little table leader discussions. And so we're going through, and it took everything in me not to be like, you guys, I'm talking to Rebecca tomorrow. So your work is infiltrating my church, and I'm super honored and excited about it.
That's wonderful. Thank you for sharing that.
So great. Okay. So today's Good Friday as the show is airing, and let me set the stage here. I was actually telling my table yesterday as we were going through your book, I was like, the thing that I appreciate so much about Rebecca is that I would consider you, and you would consider you, and everyone would consider you very academic. And yet I am not academic, and I devour your books, and I devour how you present your words to us. And so I think even as I think through Good Friday, there's conversations that I have grown up in the church my whole life. And I think I expressed this to you when we did our Christmas episode. I've grown up in the church my whole life. And so fortunately and unfortunately, I have just a lot of faith in Good Friday, and I have a lot of faith in the resurrection. Like I don't think I've ever questioned, do we think Jesus really died? Like, do we think that? Like, I have just always had that faith. And so when I interviewed you for the Christmas episode about Jesus's birth and his life, to me, it was this kind of wake up call of like, okay, Jamie, there are millions and millions and millions of people who question the things that you just take it like you believe it. You read it in the scriptures, you read the gospels, and you believe it. And I found myself thinking that again as I read your book over the weekend called Is Easter Unbelievable? 4 questions everyone should ask about the resurrection story. And so I want to start by saying I'm grateful for your work, because it actually causes me, who has a lot of faith in these things, to realize I need to understand these. So this book, Rebecca, is wonderful. It answers 4 questions. Is Jesus' death ethical? What kind of God would punish sin? Who qualifies as a sinner? And how is the brutal killing of an innocent man just? So I want to start with a question that I often ask authors. Why this book? What made you want to write this book?
A little bit like the Christmas book, actually. I think that there is so much familiarity in our culture with the basics of the Christian message, or at least, sadly, I think there's probably less familiarity with the true basics of the Christian message than people realize. But people are used to the idea that Christians are claiming that this first century Jewish man was the Son of God, that he died on a cross, and that he rose from the grave. Like, that's something that people have heard and sort of become familiar with, whether they believe it or not. And like you say, there are some people who say, do you know what, that sounds completely implausible to me. Like, I didn't believe a word of it. I think there are also a lot of people who think, yeah, that's a thing that's out there. Maybe it's true, maybe it's not. I vividly remember talking with a young woman when I was an undergrad, and we were having kind of a little Easter get together before an Easter service, and sort of inviting all sorts of friends who weren't part of the kind of Christian fellowship there. And I remember talking to this young woman, and her saying, yeah, I think Jesus is probably the Son of God. And it was like, she could, on the one hand, believe that, at least at some level. And on the other hand, it made zero difference to her. Like, it was as if that knowledge, that belief could just exist out there like a sort of theoretical belief that you and I might have that doesn't actually change our lives at all. I mean, it's going to be a little bit of a weird analogy and potentially a completely unhelpful one, so forgive me. But as I look out at the sky, I walk down the street and I see the sun, and I'm like, yeah, I know that the Earth revolves around the sun. Like, it's something that I know because scientists have told me that's the case, not because I've actually looked into it myself. It's just like, this is what I've heard from science. And it doesn't make any practical difference to my life. I'm like, oh, there's the sun. I mean, the sun makes a difference, but like the fact that the Earth revolves around the sun, who knew, kind of thing. Like if the sun revolved around the Earth, it wouldn't make any practical difference to my day-to-day life. And it seems like there are a lot of people who are walking around thinking either, Jesus is probably the Son of God. Yeah, maybe he did die on a cross. Yeah, maybe he rose, without realizing, no. These are life and death questions.
Right.
These are like, stake your whole, like, put all your cash on this question or not. We can't be only moderately interested or sort of, unsure, but is it really worth our time to look into? So part of the reason I wrote Is Easter Unbelievable is to help people say, okay, wait a minute, let's look at these claims afresh and let's get serious about, A, did this happen? And B, if it did, what difference does it make to me now?
That's really good, because I would guess that would encapsulate so many people in America, because it is such like it's felt as like this quote unquote Christian nation, and it's really easy to kind of believe these things, but they don't actually change your life, like you just said. And I really appreciate it. Okay, I want to dive into some of the things that you say in here, and I'm not going to go through each of the 4 things, guys. I want to let you know this is a book. If you're out there and you're like, I don't like really reading, I'm going to tell you, you can read this book in about like an hour and a half, 2 hours. It is really, really compact and complex all at the same time. So I want to say this. Let's just dive into Good Friday. Here we go, Rebecca. You say that the love shown in Jesus' death is even more stunning than the love shown in his life. Can you kind of unpack that? Because you talk about all the things that Jesus did in his ministry years, which we can probably name them. Even if you don't even go to church all the time, you could come up with some things culturally that you've heard about Jesus Christ. But you claim that his death showed more love than even the things he did while he was alive. Can you unpack that for us?
Yeah, Jesus showed extraordinary love during his life on earth and his ministry in ways that actually shapes how we even think about right and wrong today. And we don't always realize that, because again, we're sort of so used to it in the way that it's shaped our culture that, for example, our belief, which we probably share regardless of how we would identify spiritually, our belief that like all human beings are fundamentally equal, and that the strong and the rich and the powerful shouldn't be trampling on the weak and the poor and the marginalized, that men and women are equal, that little children are important and precious in their own right, and not just like possessions that we can kind of discard or abuse at will. Like, love across racial difference is a good thing. Like, all of these things actually come from Jesus's life and teaching and the disruptive impact that it had on the world. So why would I say that Jesus's death shows even more love than his life? Well, Jesus's teaching is profound and beautiful, and it ultimately led to his death. But in the moment of his teaching, it didn't cost Jesus to teach those extraordinary truths about human beings and about God. Jesus went around healing people. And it seems pretty clear in the gospel stories that Jesus can heal people like actually pretty easily. Sometimes he touches people to make a particular point, but sometimes he heals people just from a distance. Like, he says the word and somebody's healed. Sometimes he prays sort of out loud, but then he usually points out, like, I wasn't praying for me, but for you guys. Like, I kind of want you to say
this is for you guys. Yeah,
this is for you guys. This is so. It's like Jesus can almost, effortlessly is maybe slightly too strong, but like almost effortlessly do things which you and I couldn't do in a million years. And yet, when he goes to the cross, Jesus is showing his love for us in a way that cost him profoundly. And we see this actually especially illustrated and communicated to us in the narratives we have about the night that Jesus was arrested, when he sort of famously goes with his disciples to this garden called Gethsemane, and then he prays to God and to the Father. And we see Jesus sort of struggling in prayer there. We see him agonized. We see him like pleading with the Father to, as he put it, let this cup pass from him. And if we look back into the Old Testament scriptures, as Jesus's first disciples would have known, the image, the metaphor of the cup of the Lord in the Old Testament is typically communicating God's judgment, actually, like against whole nations. this cup that gets passed around. It's sort of devastating to receive the cup of the Lord, and it's not something that one human being takes. It's like poured out on a whole nation that's rebelling against God. And Jesus is here picturing the fact that when he dies on the cross that Friday, he is going to drink the cup of God's wrath down to the dregs for us. This one human being is going to take on himself the sin of the whole world. He's going to take the punishment. He's going to take hell for you and for me if we would put our trust in him. And that is a horrifying prospect. But it's something that he takes on willingly, actually, despite the cost, ultimately out of love for us. And that is why I think Jesus's death points to his love and illustrates and demonstrates his love for us even more than the beautiful things that he did and the beautiful things that he taught during his life on earth.
It's beautiful and profound to think about Jesus willingly knowing and doing that, because, you know, some people would say, like, did Jesus know? Did Jesus know that he was going to end up here? Was he just living 30 years and then started a ministry, and all of a sudden he's like, oh, wait, is this how this is ending? And to know that Jesus knew that this was the path for him to take the whole time is like mind-blowing.
Yeah. And he teaches his disciples, and he has to tell them multiple times they don't get it. They absolutely don't get it, because it's the last thing they thought would be the plan for God's Messiah, God's like chosen king, promised for centuries, that was going to come and save God's people. The absolute last thing that should have happened in their minds was for the Messiah, the Christ, to be crucified, like to suffer the death most associated with slaves and rebels, to have, like, instead of kicking the Romans out, which was probably what they were hoping God's Messiah would do, for the plan to be that instead Jesus should be crucified by the Romans, was like completely the opposite of what they would have envisaged. And yet Jesus there is defeating a much greater enemy than the Romans. He's defeating sin and death and hell for us. He's conquering.
You know, speaking of the cross, you talk a little bit in here about how we've kind of sanitized the cross over these 2,000 years. I mean, you see people wearing crosses around their neck. It's like, just in churches, it's just, we have made it different than what it was. But you talk a little bit about the reality of the cross. Can you speak to that a little bit, about the reality of what that would have meant in that day and age when Jesus was crucified by the Romans?
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, the crucifixion was very familiar to the first century readers of the Gospels and the people who were witnessing what was happening to Jesus, because it was the way that the Romans dealt with rebels and made an example of, especially of slaves who were sort of trying to rise up. And the cross was very specifically designed to be both like maximally painful and enduring. Like, it wasn't a quick death. It was a slow and agonizing death. And it was designed to be maximally humiliating. Like, this wasn't a sort of quiet, like, you know, execution in, you know, not that any execution is pleasant, but this was, you know, not like a lethal injection done away in a prison somewhere. This was like a very public statement of, this is what will happen to you if you try and stand up against the Romans. And so I think it's hard for us to really recognize, like, both not only the pain, but also the shame of the crucifixion. But it actually completely fits in with the ethic that Jesus was teaching and modeling. I love how he explains it to his disciples as to why it is that leadership in his kingdom is completely the reverse of leadership outside his kingdom. You know, he says, even the Son of Man, referring to himself and connecting up with an Old Testament sort of image of this extraordinary figure who would receive a kingdom from God himself that would be like enduring and universal. So even the Son of Man didn't come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. That Jesus is in many ways stepping into the lowest place and paying the price for us, taking not only, like, I mean, it's extraordinary how many things that God is doing actually at the cross, that Jesus is taking the sin of the world, the sin of anyone who would put their trust in him, is being fully paid for and dealt with on the cross. And at the same time, Jesus is taking on himself our suffering and our experience of brokenness and physical pain and alienation. And he's defeating death for us, which is the thing which I feel like that, the older you get, the less you can pretend you're never going to die.
Right.
Many of us in our sort of very kind of protected and kind of health conscious 21st century Western culture can go a decent proportion of our lives, often really, without confronting the fact that we're going to die. Maybe we've had grandparents die, or maybe we've had parents die, or maybe, people we've loved who are closer to our age. But the further we're going on in life, the less we can fail to confront the fact, yeah, you and I are going to die. And Jesus on the cross is giving us hope in the face of death, as well as all the other things that he's doing. There's so much kind of bound up in that. He is the one person who can take our hand and walk us through death into resurrection life.
A lot happened in that one day, Rebecca. Like, that was a lot going on.
Yeah.
Jesus,
Unbelievable.
that was a busy day. Historically, a lot of people can wrap their brain around Jesus's crucifixion for a lot of the reasons that you just said. Like, it was common. If you look at history, this is the way that the Romans dealt with, criminals. And so they can go like, okay, we can agree. Like, okay, Jesus, a rabbi, born of we can say that this man was crucified.
Yeah.
But then we get to the resurrection. And then we get a whole nother thing, because now what we're asking, or what God is saying, is like, here's what we could believe. We need to believe that Jesus not only was killed, okay, historically we can wrap our brain around that, but he rose from the grave. This is where people's minds just get blown, And so in your book, you walk through 4 pieces of evidence with why people can actually wrap their brain around that. I'll say them to you, and then I would love for you just to touch on whichever one you want. You say the outbreak, the message, the Romans, and the women. And so 4 pieces of evidence that you say that Jesus did truly, like he claims, rise from the dead. So can you dive into any of those that you'd like to go with?
Yeah, I think I'll start with the outbreak. So what do I mean by that? When Jesus died on the cross almost 2,000 years ago, he was the seemingly failed leader of a tiny Jewish sect in a backwater of the Roman Empire. There's very little, like if we were to go back 2,000 years, there's very little reason to think that anybody would be talking about this 2,000 years later. This guy never wrote a book, he never ruled an empire, he never raised an army, he never sat on a throne. Like, he didn't do any of the things that usually get you recorded in history. And yet here we are 2,000 years later, still talking about him. And it's not just you and me because we're weirdos. It's actually, this is a movement that is all across the world and that represents the largest global belief system today and the most diverse in any way you want to cut it. So what on earth happened to change, this small, probably there were like a few dozen followers of Jesus after he died, like a few dozen sort of disciples, not just the 12 chosen apostles, but actually a number of women who traveled with Jesus and a number of sort of other disciples. So there was kind of, little group. Yeah. Small group of heartbroken, confused, in many ways cowardly, actually. They'd run away from Jesus when the going got tough, the night that he was arrested. Jewish followers of Jesus, like, how did those people turn into a preaching team that literally changed the world in ways that we cannot avoid noticing 2,000 years later? Sort of something must have happened. Some people say, well, maybe Jesus was a charismatic leader, and then the stories about him got more and more exaggerated as time went by, and eventually, like, before we know it, like, early recruits to Christianity were saying, well, actually he was raised from the dead. Problem with that, number of problems with that, but one of them is actually, no, the resurrection is intrinsic to the Christian message from the first. There are no early recruits to Christianity if there is no resurrection. Right. Like, it's like Romeo and Juliet without Juliet. You can't, it's just not not a story other than like this leader died. So what are we going to make of this? And then we find that, the women is one of the examples that I gave there, is like, oddly, strangely, counterculturally and counterintuitively, the first witnesses of the resurrection, according to all the Gospels, are these women And to us, that doesn't strike us as particularly strange. But in that culture and in that day, the testimony of women was just not seen as legitimate as the testimony of men.
Yeah.
So why on earth would the gospel authors record that it was women who had first witnessed Jesus's resurrection? There are plenty of other sort of more plausible men who were knocking around who Jesus could have appeared to first, but it seems like he didn't. He chose to reveal himself to these women. Even the first apostles, according to Luke, like didn't believe when the women came back and told them what they'd seen. So that's like embarrassing, right? Really embarrassing. So there are all sorts of reasons why the resurrection claim, sort of wild as it sounds, has had this extraordinary impact that we need to figure out, like, what did happen? Like, if the resurrection didn't happen, what on earth did? And then I think it's important to recognize, like, there are probably a lot of people who would think, you know, I can believe that there is a God. Like, maybe there's a God who made the world. But the idea of somebody being raised from the dead, like, that just seems like a supernatural bridge too far. You know, that's pushing the envelope a bit. But actually, if you think about it, if there is a God who made the universe and everyone in it, it's not at all irrational to think that he could do a miracle like raising somebody from the dead. Right. Like, it's actually kind of irrational to think that couldn't be possible.
Right.
So, you know, if there's no God, of course somebody couldn't be raised from the dead. But if we're open to the possibility, yeah, maybe there is a God, then we should also be open to the possibility that God sent his only son, not only to die for us, but also to be raised so that we could live with him forever. And that's the piece I think can get lost even by well-meaning Christians as we try to articulate our faith. We sort of explain, well, Jesus died on the cross to pay for your sin and for mine so we could be back in relationship with God. Oh, and then Jesus rose from the dead. We're not quite sure why. Like, maybe it certainly proved that what he'd said was true, but how it's relevant to us today, we're not always quite sure. And actually, the invitation of the Christian message is to be united with this Jesus who died for us and who rose to not only to pave the way for us to have resurrection life, but actually to live with us, to be, as he explained to one of his first female disciples, Martha, in John's Gospel, he is the resurrection and the life. And none of us truly can have life apart from him, either before our death or afterwards.
You know, speaking of the resurrection, you tell a story in here. You were talking about heaven at the end of this book, and you talk about your friend Grace. And at the point in the book, I don't even know, I should have asked before I brought this up. At the point in the book, she was battling cancer, and she had already previously lost her spouse a decade before. And I got a little teary-eyed when I was reading it, because what you hear a lot of people say, and I would just want to confess, like, this really convicted me, like, when I read this, is you hear a lot of people say, like, well, I can't wait in death to be reunited with my loved ones. And I can't, and we would have expected your friend Grace to say, I can't wait to be reunited with my husband, who she'd been apart from for a decade. And that feels very real and human, you know, like this desire to be back with the people that we've loved so much. And in the book, you tell that your friend Grace actually said, we're often setting our sights too low. And for her, it was the being united with her Savior. So can you expand on that a little bit?
Yeah,
and Grace, my tears up over here.
No, Grace died a few months ago and went to be with Jesus. And I got to know her after she was diagnosed with terminal cancer. I had no idea what a gift it would be for me to get to know her in that period. I had reached out because this has been announced to the membership at our church, and I thought, you know, she's a somewhat older lady in our church. Our church trends very young, so you know, she was probably I think she was in her early 60s, thereabouts. You know, we thought, like, after 40, the demographics of my church sort of slimmed down. So I was like, you know, this sister in Christ who I know is single and you know, facing death, and I wanted to reach out to just sort of offer love. I had no idea, as I say, kind of how I would benefit from our friendship. But yeah, one of the things she'd shared with me was conversation. She had sort of similar conversations, actually, both with her daughter and with her brother-in-law. He was saying, you know, her daughter was saying, I think of heaven as a place where we'll get to see Papa again, you know, having dearly loved her father and knowing how much her mum had loved her father, and who died 10 years previously. And Grace's response was, I think we're setting our sights too low. And that just so beautifully expresses the biblical truth that even in the best human relationship, even in the most intimate and fulfilling human marriage, what we're getting is a tiny little echo, shadow, foretaste of Jesus's love for us. Marriage is actually at its best designed to show us Jesus's sacrificial love. And so we're actually foolish if what we're looking forward to after death primarily is being reunited with those we've truly loved in terms of our human experience. We're foolish if that's the thing that we're most looking forward to, because even at their best, those relationships are pointing us to something even better. And Grace knew that, and it was a joy to me to sort of walk with her through her final months and just get to kind of observe what it looks like for a Christian who believes in the resurrection to die with confidence and faith. The very last text she sent me, she was a writer as well and had written a number of articles for a local news station. And they had decided they wanted to sort of chronicle her cancer and sort of stay with her basically to the end, of doing various sort of video and kind of audio projects with her. And her last text to me says, they've decided to follow me kind of to the end, and I'm praying for opportunities to share my faith. I was thinking, that is how I want to die.
All the way to the end.
Yeah.
Well, I read that and was really convicted and remember praying and just asking God, to like redirect my heart, because it's not like it's not like I wasn't aware of like our greatest joy. It's not like I'm unaware of that marriage is a slim reflection of what it, like I have all this knowledge, but then sometimes my emotions can get in the way, and I would feel myself like Grace's daughter saying, oh, this would be what I would be most excited about. And just really asking God, man, it is like you said, it is a slim reflection of the love that Jesus has for us. And so I appreciated that story in there so much. And I'm sorry about your loss as well, but I'm super happy that Grace has been united with our Savior, just like she was looking forward to. You guys, this book is really, really, like I said, compact and very, very, very informative as well. It's called Is Easter Unbelievable? 4 questions everyone should ask about the resurrection story. You can get it anywhere you buy books. I really appreciate it. Rebecca, while I have you, I know that you also just released a Bible study called Navigating Gospel Truth, a guide to faithful reading the account of Jesus's life. And I was thinking about this Bible study because as we've been even speaking today, we have said numerous times, you have said about how this would have been so this was so out of the disciples' concept of what Jesus was to do. And so I was thinking as we were speaking earlier, I was like, man, I have grown up in the church my whole life, and I wonder what it would feel like, Rebecca, to not know the end of the story as I was reading the Gospels. Like I'm starting in Matthew 1, and although Jesus predicts his death throughout, but what if I was like the disciples and it's just like, what? This happened? I didn't even know it. And so I would love to hear, just tell us a little bit about this Bible study, Navigating Gospel Truth, a guide to faithful reading the accounts of Jesus' life.
Yeah, I had a lot of fun writing that study in some ways because my background is in English literature. I did a PhD on like metaphors in Shakespeare, which, people don't ask me to talk about that a whole lot these days, funnily enough. Anytime you want to have a podcast episode. No. But one of the things that's always struck me is how, we'll sometimes be asked if you're a Christian, or you might ask if you're not a Christian in particular, do you take the Bible literally? Mm-hmm. Or do you take the gospel accounts of Jesus' life literally? And usually when people are asking that question, what they're really meaning is like, do you believe the crazy things that the Gospels are telling us about Jesus? Like, do you really believe that Jesus, rose from the dead, for instance?
Yeah.
But we frame it as, do you take this literally? And I think it's super important that we kind of pause and unpack that a bit, because actually a lot of the time in the Gospels, Jesus himself is very intentionally speaking in non-literal forms of communication. So, one example is Jesus saying, I am the good shepherd, and the good shepherd lays down his life for his sheep. Mm-hmm. Now, if we read that literally, then Jesus is saying that he is literally somebody who kind of walks around with furry mammals that have 4 legs and go, meh, like, and that he is planning to die for those furry mammals. Mm-hmm. Now, when we kind of put it in those terms, we realize it's absurd to think that Jesus is speaking literally. Instead, What he's doing is he is gathering up this massive Old Testament metaphor of God as a shepherd. Famously in Psalm 23, the Lord is my shepherd; I shall not be in want. And this idea of God's king as a shepherd, like he's sort of grabbing all of those metaphors and Old Testament metaphors about us being like sheep who've gone astray and turned everyone to his own way, as Isaiah puts it, and how the Lord has laid on the suffering servant all of our sin. So he's sort of gathering up all these Old Testament metaphors into this picture and saying, I'm the good shepherd lays down his life for his sheep. But we need to kind of understand, like, how do metaphors work for us to really faithfully understand what Jesus is saying there? Because if we read it literally, we're going to misunderstand him. And that's true time and time again in the Gospels. Now, some people say, well, okay, if you're going to say some things in the Gospels are metaphors, then why can't we just use that whenever something's inconvenient? Mm-hmm. So like the resurrection, can we just not say that it's a like metaphorical resurrection? Well, actually, no, because the Gospels are really very clear that they are talking about a physical, bodily resurrection. Have Jesus come and like he's eating things and touching people and whatever, like after his resurrection. And yet, so we need to kind of hold these two pieces together, and we need to recognize that often Jesus is telling stories, parables, as we sometimes call them, in the Gospels. And we need to think, okay, how do we faithfully read a story which is not necessarily telling us about historical realities? So, for example, the famous parable of the Good Samaritan, when Jesus reports this, crime happening between Jerusalem and Jericho, and you're thinking, well, the point of this story is actually not Jesus reporting on a crime scene and somebody dial 911 and get the police here because this guy's been beaten up. He's actually communicating profound truths about us and about God through this story. And so I wrote this Bible study to help us kind of navigate these different kinds of communication, whether it's metaphors or stories, or this funny thing called hyperbole, which is like extreme exaggeration to make a very serious point. Like, how do we navigate these things?
So good. You guys, you can get this. It's out now already, wherever you get stuff, Navigating Gospel Truths. Rebecca, I want to say one of the things that has been really profound for me in the last probably, 10 years of my life is knowing why I believe what I believe. And I mentioned to you probably every time I interview you of just like taking these concepts that I have had so much faith in for all my life and really figuring out, why do I believe these things? Why do I believe these things? And I remember about probably 15 years ago now, I was having a conversation with one of my kids, and he's 19 now. And so, he would have been a little bitty kid. And he asked me a question that was really profound about faith, and I didn't know the answer. And I said to him, well, you know what? How about when your dad gets home, we can ask him, because your dad's a pastor. Let's just throw all these his way. And I remember God did something really, like, I'm grateful for it, really profound in my heart, where I thought to myself, why do I not care about knowing how to answer my 4, 5, 6, 7 as he grew up child? Why do I think that should just be something Aaron does because he's a pastor? And so God started me on this journey of really wanting to be a learner, like really wanting to just take what I believe in faith and learn about it. And I'm saying all this to say that I remember I had a conversation with a mutual friend of ours. I call her my friend. I've really only interviewed her, but I'm going to claim her, with Rachel Gilson. And I remember thinking to myself, we had a conversation about her book, Born Again This Way. And great book, by the way, great episode, all the things, everybody go, all the things. And I remember I said to her, one of the things that I think is so important for believers is that we understand why we believe that we believe. Because there will come a day when it will come in question.
Yeah.
And parenting for 19 years, being a faithful follower of Jesus for all these years, that moment in time where I was like, God, I need to know why I believe what I believe. It has proven to be true that I do need to know what I believe, why I believe. Faith is amazing, but we live in a culture that wants to know why we believe what we believe. And so all of that to say, I'm just, these conversations about Easter and about Christmas and even about dissecting, what did Jesus mean when he said, well, good shepherd? I didn't know he was a shepherd. I'm trying to encourage the listener that these matter to us as followers of Jesus. They matter because we know him more through it, and they matter because it helps increase our witness to the world. And so I want to say thank you for writing all these things.
Well, and let it be known that I am continually asked questions, especially by my 10 and 4-year-old kids, where I don't know the answer. So it's not something that goes away, but I agree that the more we're asked questions and we think, you know what, I've never really thought about that. If I'm honest, I've sort of just like let that be a thing in my head without really grappling with it. I think sometimes as Christians we can be nervous, like if I really looked into the resurrection, maybe I become less convinced.
Right.
I've actually found completely the opposite. When I really look into something, I become more convinced about Jesus and not less.
And that's good news for people who are in my boat with parenting like older kids, who Aaron and I want our kids to get their own faith. It's impossible. You cannot hang on the coattails of somebody else's faith. And so when you think those questions are hard when they're 4, wait till they're like in their late teen years and they're questioning everything you've ever talked about, and not always in a bad way, but just like, wait, what? I agree with you that it is in those questions that we actually, when we dig through and we dive in and we figure out what is this saying, that our faith becomes stronger, which is beautiful. Rebecca, thank you so much for coming on the Happy Hour. I wasn't even prepared to ask you what you're reading, but I bet you are reading something right now. What are you reading these days?
Well, I just finished. I was going to tell you about the book I just finished, but I'll tell you about the book I'm actually reading. I'm finally reading a book called A Secular Age by a Canadian Catholic philosopher called Charles Taylor, which people have been talking about this book. I've been reading books that are derivative of this book for a long time. And I was like, you know what? I really need to sit down. In fact, I said to Rachel Goss, I was like, do I need to read this book? She was like, yeah, you do. It is a long and heavy read. I think I'm like 550 pages in and there are another couple of 100 pages to go.
Okay. Yeah.
But it has been really interesting is he's trying to give an account of like how the context in which people think about faith has changed in the last like 500 years in the West, and what are the features of that. One of the big surprises of the last few decades is actually that rather than the world becoming much more secular as it's become more modern and more scientific and more educated kind of globally, rather than that happening, that actually we continue to see very, very vigorous faith commitment. First, Christians are the largest faith group, Muslims the second. And actually, if you look at kind of global trends, then it's those who identify as non-religious, that group is actually declining rather than those who identify as Christians, sort of surprisingly. But one of the things we have found in the modern world is that fewer and fewer people are Christians because they've never encountered any other option. We're not fewer and fewer of us are living in a world where you never even question whether the resurrection happened, because like literally everybody you've ever met thinks that it did. We're actually all living in a world where one way or another we'll have neighbors who will believe very different things to us, and that just sort of changes how we think about faith in ways that can be positive and can be negative, and we sort of need to sift through that. So it's been very interesting and educational.
Very interesting. Very interesting.
I should have read it probably 5 years ago.
What did you just finish reading?
I just finished reading a book called Biblical Critical Theory by an old friend of mine from Cambridge days, actually, called Chris Watkin, which is a delightful book. Also rather substantial, but certainly a much easier read than Charles Taylor's.
I love it. Well, Rebecca, thank you so much for the work you're doing. Thank you for coming back on the Happy Hour, and grateful for all you're doing.